You're listening to the final frequency. Last broadcast, Chernobyl. We are going inside. When I ended last week's transmission, I told you we would follow the truth through every room it was locked out of. I meant that. Tonight we go into the rooms. Into the control room of Reactor 4 at the moment it ceased to be a reactor and became something for which the Soviet technical lexicon had no prepared word. Into the corridor of the Pripyat medical clinic, where a doctor began seeing patients whose symptoms she recognized and whose cause she was told to misattribute. Into the street of a city of 50,000 people on a spring morning while an open nuclear core burned 4 kilometers upwind. These rooms exist in testimony, in the accounts of the people who were inside them and who survived long enough to speak. Some of them did not survive long enough to speak. Some of them knew what had happened to them and died knowing that the country they had served was going to lie about it. In the 40 years since that night, I have spoken to survivors, to engineers, to first responders, to doctors, to diplomats, to intelligence analysts who were watching the same frequencies I was watching from different rooms in different countries. I have read documents that were classified for decades and have since become available. I have sat with this information for a very long time, and it still makes me cold. Tonight I am going to take you through what actually happened inside that plant in the hours after the explosion. What the engineers knew, what the firefighters were told, what the doctors saw, and how a machine designed to suppress information began operating within minutes of the explosion with a speed and efficiency that I find, even now, almost more disturbing than the accident itself. This is Last Broadcast. This is Chernobyl. And this is the inside of a lie that killed people for decades after the explosion stopped. The safety test that destroyed Reactor 4 had been scheduled for the day shift on April 25th. It was delayed. A power demand from the Ukrainian grid meant the reactor had to keep running longer than planned. By the time the test was authorized to proceed, it was the night shift. A crew that had not been briefed on the test procedure. A crew that had just come on duty. This matters. Because what happened in that control room in the moments after the explosion cannot be fully understood without understanding that the people in it were exhausted, underprepared, and operating a reactor that had been behaving erratically for hours. The man running the test was Anatoly Dyatlov, Deputy Chief Engineer. He had pushed for the test to proceed despite the conditions. He had overridden safety concerns raised by members of his own team in the hours before the explosion. At 1:23 and 45 seconds, the reactor power surged to approximately 30,000 megawatts, 10 times its normal operating capacity, in 3 seconds. The shift foreman, Alexander Akimov, ordered the emergency shutdown button pressed. The button that was supposed to insert control rods into the reactor to halt the reaction. It did not halt the reaction. The control rods, due to a design flaw that Soviet engineers had identified in internal documents years earlier and had not corrected, actually accelerated the power surge at the moment of insertion. Within seconds, the reactor had experienced a steam explosion that blew the 1,000-ton reactor lid off the building, followed by a second explosion, the nature of which is still debated, that destroyed the reactor core entirely. In the control room, the lights went out. Akimov and the reactor operator Leonid Toptanov believed, or chose to believe, that the reactor was still intact, that the explosions had been conventional, that the core could still be cooled if they kept pumping water into it. They spent the next hours attempting to cool a reactor that no longer existed. They pumped water into rubble, into an open nuclear core that was releasing radiation at levels that would kill them within weeks. They did this because the alternative, acknowledging what had actually happened, was something the human mind in that moment could not fully accept. I have spoken to engineers who were in adjacent parts of the facility that night, who described colleagues walking through areas of lethal radiation without dosimeters because the dosimeters available couldn't read the actual levels and had simply pinned at their maximum and been set aside as malfunctioning. Instruments that told the truth were assumed to be broken because the truth was unreadable. Dyatlov, who survived longer than Akimov and Toptanov, told investigators later that he had refused to believe the reactor had exploded. He said he had seen the aftermath. He had been told what the instruments were showing, and he had refused to believe it because an RBMK reactor could not explode, because Soviet reactor design did not permit that failure mode, because the system was not supposed to be capable of this. The system told him it couldn't happen. The system was wrong. And by the time he accepted what the evidence in front of him was saying, he had sent people into that evidence without protection. Akimov died on May 11th, 11 days after the explosion. Toptanov died on May 14th, 13 days after the explosion. Both died of acute radiation syndrome. Both died believing they had done everything they could to stop something that had already been stopped by the explosion before they began. The first fire engines arrived at the plant at 1:28 a.m., 3 minutes after the explosion. The crew of the first vehicle, Lieutenant Vladimir Pravik leading, could see two fires, one on the roof of the turbine hall, one in the area of Reactor 4. They had been told it was a standard industrial fire, a roof fire, the kind they trained for, the kind that required standard equipment and standard procedure. Lieutenant Pravik was 23 years old. The firefighters were not told they were approaching an open nuclear core. They were not given adequate dosimeters. The dosimeters they had, the same type as inside the plant, could not read the actual radiation levels. The needles pinned at maximum, and the firefighters, following the logic of the situation, assumed the instruments were malfunctioning. They climbed onto the roof of the reactor building. They picked up pieces of burning graphite with their gloved hands because graphite fires require physical removal. You cannot extinguish them with water. They breathed the smoke rising from nuclear fuel that had been blown into the open air by the explosion. Major Leonid Telyatnikov, who coordinated the firefighting effort that night and survived, barely, after months of medical treatment, said in testimony years later that the firefighters on the roof began showing symptoms within an hour of arrival. Severe nausea, a metallic taste in the mouth, skin that felt like it was burning from the inside. The metallic taste is significant. It is one of the first symptoms of acute radiation syndrome. The ionizing radiation interacts with saliva to produce a distinctive taste. It is, in a sense, the body registering what the instruments had failed to register. The human organism detecting what the equipment had been too limited to measure. The firefighters tasted it and kept working, because they had not been told. 28 of the first responders to Chernobyl died of acute radiation syndrome in the months following the explosion. Most of them were between 20 and 30 years old. Most of them had been told they were attending a fire. Most of them had not been given the information that would have allowed them to make an informed decision about the risk they were taking. The Soviet state made that decision for them. It decided they did not need to know. They found out, the way the residents of Pripyat were finding out, the way that does not come with a choice, through their bodies. At approximately 6 in the morning on April 26th, a doctor arrived for her shift at the Pripyat Medical Clinic. I will call her by her first name only, Valentina, because although her account has been documented, she requested in later interviews that her full name not be used in connection with this period of her professional life. She told me this herself. I spoke to her once in 1998 through an interpreter. She said, "I knew within the first hour. I had the patients in front of me and I knew. And I was told that I was wrong." By 6:30, she had seen 4 patients, all of them plant workers or emergency responders, all of them presenting with the same cluster of symptoms: severe nausea, vomiting, erythema, the reddening of the skin that looks like severe sunburn and is one of the early markers of acute radiation exposure. She diagnosed probable acute radiation syndrome and reached for the telephone to report to the regional medical authority. The person she spoke to at the regional authority told her that the plant had experienced a minor incident, that radiation levels were within acceptable parameters, that the symptoms she was describing were consistent with stress responses and possible chemical exposure from the industrial fire that had occurred overnight. She was told to treat the symptoms conservatively and to log them under the classification of chemical exposure. Not radiation, chemical exposure. Valentina told me that she stood with the telephone in her hand for what she said felt like a long time, that she looked at her patients and looked at the classification she had been told to use and understood something very clearly in that moment. She said, "I understood that the decision about what had happened had already been made above me, that my role was not to diagnose. My role was to record what I had been told to record." She told me she complied. She logged the cases as chemical exposure. She treated the symptoms as best she could with the resources available. She said, "I have thought about those 4 patients every day since. Whether what I did, what I was told to do, made a difference to what happened to them. Whether if I had refused, whether if I had insisted." She paused in the interview for a long time. She said, "I don't know. I will never know. That is the thing I carry." By the end of Valentina's shift that morning, she had seen 16 patients with the same symptom cluster. By evening, the number was higher. By the time Pripyat was evacuated the following day, 36 hours after the explosion, the clinic had processed more acute radiation cases than the regional classification system had a code for. They were all logged as chemical exposure, every single one. I want to tell you about the city that morning, because Pripyat on the morning of April 26, 1986, is one of the most painful things I know about this event, not because of what happened in it, because of what didn't. It was a Saturday, a spring morning. The weather was pleasant, mild, clear, the kind of early spring day in Ukraine that people remember as beautiful. Children went to school. Some schools had sports events planned for the day. There are accounts, verified accounts, not estimates, of children playing football on outdoor pitches within sight of the plant that morning. A school trip had been organized for a group of children from the city. They went. A wedding took place in Pripyat that day, April 26, 1986. Photographs exist. The wedding party is outdoors. They are smiling. The sky above them is the sky that was carrying fallout from an open reactor core 4 kilometers away. The radiation plume from the explosion was invisible. It had no smell. It produced no immediate pain or visible effect in low to moderate doses. The residents of Pripyat had no way of knowing, walking to work or dropping their children at school or attending a wedding, that they were moving through air that was doing things to their cells that would express themselves in the coming months and years as cancers, as thyroid disease, as conditions their doctors would spend the next decade trying to connect to a cause that the Soviet state insisted was not the cause. 50,000 people in a city specifically built to house the workers of the plant, 3 kilometers from the reactor, on a spring Saturday, going about their lives because no one told them. The evacuation order for Pripyat was signed at 1400 hours on April 27th, 2 p.m. 36 hours and 37 minutes after the explosion. The buses arrived at 2 p.m. The residents were told to take 3 days of belongings. They were told it was precautionary. They were told they would be back. The city of Pripyat has not been permanently inhabited since. The belongings people left behind are still there. The school notebooks, the toys, the wedding photographs in the flat where the couple returned after the ceremony and began their life together on the afternoon of April 26, 1986, in a city they did not know they were leaving forever. 36 hours. That decision, the decision to wait 36 hours, was made by specific people in specific rooms. People who had information. People who understood, or should have understood, what that information meant for 50,000 people living 3 kilometers from an open reactor core. They chose to wait. And 50,000 people went to school and to work and to weddings while they waited. I want to tell you how the information was controlled, because it was not accidental. It was not the result of confusion or inadequate communication infrastructure. The suppression of accurate information about Chernobyl was organized, deliberate, and effective for a significant period of time. It began, as I told you last week, within 3 minutes. Do not use the word accident. That instruction established the linguistic framework before the fires were out. By 3 a.m., the KGB, the Soviet Security Service, had officers on site at the plant. This I know from documents that became available after the dissolution of the Soviet Union. The KGB's role in the immediate aftermath of Chernobyl was not to investigate. It was to manage, to determine what had happened, to determine what could be said about what had happened, and to ensure that those two things were not the same. The KGB filed reports to Moscow through the night. Accurate reports, internally within their own channels. The KGB knew the true radiation readings within hours. They knew the reactor had experienced a catastrophic failure rather than a conventional accident. They knew the scale of the potential health impact on the population of Pripyat and the surrounding region. Simultaneously, the official reports being filed through the plant's own chain of command, the reports that Brukhanov sent to Moscow, the reports that the regional party officials were sending, contained the falsified figures, the 3.6, the manageable numbers, the language of an incident rather than a catastrophe. The KGB knew the truth. The official reports said otherwise. And Moscow, receiving both sets of information, chose to act on the official reports. Chose. For reasons that historians continue to debate and that I believe involve a combination of institutional self-preservation, political calculation, and the sheer inability of a system built on the suppression of bad news to process bad news of this magnitude, to proceed as though the manageable numbers were real. The decision not to evacuate Pripyat immediately was not made by people who did not know. It was made by people who had access to information that told them the truth. They chose the official version. They chose the 3.6. And 50,000 people paid the cost of that choice. I want to be honest with you about something, about the limits of what I knew in April 1986, and what it has taken 40 years to understand fully. On the night of April 25th, in my room in Vienna, with my shortwave receiver and my notebook, I knew something significant had happened. I knew the communications were wrong. I knew the numbers being reported officially were being treated internally as preliminary and uncertain. I did not know about Akimov and Toptonov pumping water into rubble. I did not know about the firefighters tasting metal on the roof of the reactor building. I did not know about Valentina in the Pripyat clinic logging radiation cases as chemical exposure. I did not know about the wedding. These things I learned over years, through sources who came forward slowly, carefully, at significant personal risk, through documents that were classified for a decade and a half and then became available when the Soviet Union ceased to exist and its filing systems became partially accessible. I have spent 40 years building this picture, adding details, correcting early assumptions, sitting with the weight of each new piece of information and understanding what it meant for the people who were inside the events I was monitoring from a room 800 kilometers away. I could not have known all of it in 1986. What I could have known, what I did know and published 2 days late, was enough. Enough to tell the residents of Pripyat, if anyone had been listening to a freelance journalist's shortwave intercepts in Vienna, that something serious enough to require evacuation had occurred near their city. I did not have a platform that reached them. I want to be honest about that. Even if I had published immediately on the night of April 26th, the information would not have reached the people it needed to reach. The Soviet media system ensured that. But I think about the 2 days anyway, the gap between what I knew and when I said it. 2 days. I think about Valentina, about the wedding photographs, about the children on the football pitch. Journalists are not responsible for what governments do. We are responsible for what we do, for how quickly we move, for how clearly we speak, for whether we let caution become a reason to delay information that people need. I have tried to be faster ever since. I am not sure I have always succeeded. Here is what this episode has given us. Inside the plant, engineers who knew within minutes and continued working because the truth was structurally impossible within their worldview. Firefighters who were sent towards something they were not told to fear. A doctor who diagnosed the truth and was told to record a different one. And a city of 50,000 people who spent 36 hours inside a catastrophe they had not been informed was happening. And running through all of it, the KGB on site by 3 a.m. with accurate information, and Moscow receiving 2 sets of numbers and choosing the wrong one. The organized, deliberate management of a truth that was killing people while it was being managed. Next week, I am going to take you into what came after. The liquidators. The 200,000 people who were sent into the exclusion zone over the following months to manage the consequences of an accident whose scale they were also not fully told. The health data that was classified for decades. The cancer rates in Belarus and Ukraine in the years following 1986 that Soviet and then post-Soviet authorities spent years insisting were not connected to Chernobyl. The cover-up did not end with the explosion. It did not end with the evacuation. It did not end when the Soviet Union ended. There are documents that remain classified. There are health studies that have never been published. There are questions about the full extent of the radiological impact that official bodies, Soviet, Russian, international, have consistently answered with numbers that independent researchers have consistently challenged. The reactor exploded in 1986. The cover-up is still running. I want to end tonight with something Valentina said to me in 1998. At the end of our interview, after she had described the morning of April 26th and the cases she had treated and the classification she had been told to use, I asked her what she wanted people to know. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "I want them to know that the people in Pripyat were not stupid. They were not careless. They were not uninformed because they didn't care about their safety. They were uninformed because someone made a decision that they did not need to know." She said, "That decision had a face. It had a name. It sat in a room and it looked at a piece of paper that told it the truth, and it chose a different piece of paper." She said, "I want people to know that silence has a face. Silence has a face. I have spent 40 years trying to find that face, to name it, to describe it clearly enough that the next time someone in a room looks at two pieces of paper, the true one and the manageable one, and reaches for the manageable one, someone somewhere is already holding a microphone." This is Last Broadcast. Silence has a face. We are going to find it.